Hey guys, welcome back to History in Stitches. Today you are here for our Halloween episode, and we're talking about the history of Halloween while we crochet really cute pumpkins. So if you have not seen the videos on how to do the pumpkins, I've got this style of pumpkin and a little bobble style of pumpkin. Both of these videos are on my channel. So if you somehow missed those, go back, get your materials, get your stuff together, and then come back here and we will crochet while we talk about the history of Halloween. So if you are already ready to crochet, let's get right into it. All right, so the history of Halloween, a lot of people agree that it has its roots mostly in the Celtic culture and the Christian culture. So if we're going to talk about the Celtic culture, we really need to kind of hit on a little bit of the history of Britain and the British Isles. I know Ireland and Britain are not the same thing. I get it. I understand. But just let's do an overview. So we know that the British Isles, Ireland, Britain are islands. And so they are not presently connected to Europe. But about 44,000 years ago, they might have been, and we see some evidence that there were people in that area from that time period. However, the Ice Age, the latest Ice Age happened, and it got pretty cold up there, so it kind of pushed all of those people south, and it's not until about 11,600 years ago that we see people coming back into the area that is now Britain and Ireland. Those people were just hunter-gatherers for a long time. And then in about 4000 BC, we see a new migration come in to that area from Europe. And those are the farmers. Those people started farming and they kind of changed the landscape of that area. And that's when eventually we start to see things like Stonehenge and Woodhenge and things like that. And then around 800 BCE, we start to see the Celts come in. So the Celts were there in Ireland for a long time. We know that the Romans came into Britain and ruled that for a while, but they never really made it as far as Ireland, so we don't see as much Roman influence. There's still some, obviously, but mostly it was the Celts there until about 400 AD when the Christians came in and they started doing their thing in Ireland. So the Celts were not just one tribe of people. It was a whole bunch of different tribes that were connected by kind of a similar culture and language. And a lot of times those tribes were warring with each other. And so scientists think that the people that kind of kept them together as one group were actually the priests of the group, because the priests could travel from one tribe to another without, getting murdered, as it were. And so they kept that common language and culture alive because they traveled between the groups and just kept it all going. The Celts came from Europe, most recently northern France, but they actually think their roots were probably from somewhere around the Czech Republic. But these guys celebrated a festival called Samhain. Now, I know y'all have heard of this festival. You just don't know you've heard of it because all of us Americans probably pronounce it Samhain because that's how it's spelled. But apparently it's pronounced Samhain. So Samhain was one of the 4 fire festivals of the year, and it was the most prominent fire festival of the year, and it was celebrated halfway between the fall equinox and the winter solstice, which happens to be right around the end of October. And the festival itself was kind of meant as a harvest festival. They were bringing in the harvest, but they were also acknowledging the fact that they were going to go into the dark half of the year where things, including possibly themselves, would be dying off. The other thought with Samhain is that they also thought that was the night where the veil between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead was very thin, and that spirits and ghosts could come back to our realm and haunt us, as it were. Kind of sounds similar to Day of the Dead, doesn't it? So a lot of scholars think that Halloween has a lot of roots in Samhain, but also in the fact that, like I said, the Christians came to Ireland and then they added their traditions to the mishmash. And their tradition was the tradition of All Saints' Day, which is also known as All Hallows' Day. And that is on November 1st. That was a celebration to recognize and pray to and pray for the souls of all saints that had passed. So not just the famous saints, but all saints. And it also happens to be known as All Hallows Day. Well, it's celebrated on November 1st, which means October 31st would be All Hallows Eve. And you can see how that kind of changed and evolved, and we got Halloween. So that's where the name Halloween comes from. So what about all of the other customs that we associate with Halloween? We've got candy and trick-or-treating and ghosts and goblins and all sorts of things. So let's kind of tackle those subjects one at a time. So the first one is pretty easy to tackle. Let's talk about the colors of Halloween. So we all, well, I would imagine most of us, associate black and orange with Halloween. And you might be tempted to think that that is because of pumpkins, but it is not, because All Hallows Eve and Samhain were celebrated long before pumpkins came into the mix. People think that probably orange is associated with Halloween because it is the color of harvest. You know, you think about wheat or things like that, but also it was a fire festival, and orange is definitely the color of fire. Black is thought to be associated because, like I said, it was a fire festival that celebrated the harvest and the acknowledgement that they were going into the dark time of the year, and what a better acknowledgement of dark than black. A lot of people also now associate green and purple with Halloween, and those were thought to have come later. They were thought, well, it is thought that purple and green were kind of added to make Halloween kind of more kid-friendly. So the costumes. So like I said, the Celts thought that the veil between the living and the dead was very thin on Halloween night. And I've heard a couple of theories about this. So not only did they think that the living and the dead were together that night, but they also thought Samhain was a good night for the Fae to come out. And so I have heard that people would dress up in animal skins and costumes to confuse the Fae so that the Fae could not kidnap them and take them back to their Fae realm. I have also read that because people thought that the spirits could come out that night, that the Celts would dress up in things like ghosts or goblins or masks, because if they had to go out, they would blend in and the spirits would leave them alone. So costumes evolved over the years. Obviously, we still like to do spooky costumes, but now kids like to be superheroes and things like that. So in the 1950s, Halloween became more of a kids' holiday because, as we'll hear in a minute, the 1930s got a little wild with Halloween and they tried to calm it down a little bit and gear it more towards kids. And so that's where some of the superheroes and cowboys and things like that start to come into play costume-wise. All right, so let's talk about that a little bit. So the whole tradition of trick-or-treating and giving out candy has its roots in Samhain and in mumming. So mumming was something that they used to do in England, and people would dress up in costumes and go house to house, and they would recite a poem or sing a song or do something silly in return for a treat. So sounds a lot like trick-or-treating, right? The other thing that people used to do was called souling. And what souling was is people that were not very well off would go from house to house and they would offer to pray for the souls of your relatives in return for a soul cake. So both of those things definitely have trick-or-treating as their descendant. They're both definitely connected to trick-or-treating. Now, what started to happen is that in the 1930s, Halloween started to get a little nuts. And when I mean a little nuts, the tricking became a lot more important than the treating. And so they were having trouble because people would be taking their neighbors' fences apart and sticking the fence in trees, or people were cutting down telephone poles and flipping cars over and all sorts of things like that. And it was problematic in part because people were also wearing costumes, so they felt like the costume would give them some cover and they couldn't get caught in their mischievous deeds as much. So in the 1930s, a lot of people did not like Halloween because it was a night that their stuff just basically got destroyed, you know, like the purge or something. In the 1940s, when the war started, Halloween calmed down a little bit because the government even had posters out about how it was unpatriotic to celebrate Halloween. Basically, they were saying, you know, if you use toilet paper to TP someone's house, or soap to put that on someone's window, or poke holes in the tires of cars, all of those things would have to be replaced. And in wartime, they didn't have the resources. All those resources were supposed to go to the soldiers. So during World War II, Halloween kind of died out for a while because it was unpatriotic to do all of those things. Plus, you didn't have a lot of extra food. Everything was being rationed. You didn't have a lot of sugar. So trick-or-treating was definitely not in fashion during the war. But when the war was over, trick-or-treating came back and Halloween celebrations came back. But like I said, they tried to put a little different spin on it. They tried to make Halloween more for kids. They started passing out, at first it was homemade treats, like little homemade donuts or popcorn balls, things like that, to encourage the kids to treat and not trick. But then the candy companies kind of got involved and saw like, ooh, we could make little prepackaged candy and make a whole lot of money. And so that's kind of why we do prepackaged candy nowadays. But yeah, they think that that's also where the tradition of haunted houses came from, because people would start setting up like haunted houses and scary things for the kids to do so that they weren't out being destructive. So that covers the costumes, the colors, the names, the candy, the trick-or-treating. The thing we have left to talk about is for sure the jack-o'-lantern. So we're making pumpkins right now because pumpkins are so associated with Halloween, but that wasn't always the case. So they think, well, there's two kind of different theories on why we do pumpkins with candles in them for Halloween. One theory is that the Celts, going back to the Celts again, they had kind of a thing for beheading people. They loved to behead their enemies and then put their heads on display outside of their houses. So there's some thought that because the spirits were out that night, that the Celts would try and scare the spirits away by putting that fake head on their front porch and basically saying like, you don't want to come here. I'm a big warrior and look, I've already got heads on my porch. So that's one thought. The other thought is that jack-o'-lanterns come from the story of Stingy Jack. So Stingy Jack, I'll tell you the story. It's kind of nutty, but here's the story of Stingy Jack. So there was a guy and his name was Jack, and he was known to be kind of a grouch. But one night he was walking home on a road and he met a peasant that needed help. And it was very uncharacteristic of him, but he decided to help the peasant. Well, it turns out that the peasant was an angel in disguise, and apparently an angel mixed with a djinn of some sort, because this angel gave Jack 3 wishes. Well, Jack, being stingy and grouchy like he was, the 3 things he wished for were, the first thing was that if anyone sat in his chair, they would be stuck and rooted to the spot forever. The second wish was that if anyone took any of the limbs of his tree, they would be rooted to the spot and stuck there forever. And the third wish is that if anyone used any of his tools, you guessed it, they would be rooted to the spot and stuck there forever. So he was being very stingy, even with his wishes. So the angel granted the wishes because she said she would, but made a mental note to not let Jack into heaven. So now we get the devil involved. So apparently Jack was drinking one night and the devil came for him and his soul. And Jack said, "Oh, come on, let me have one more drink. At least pay for my drinks." Well, the devil doesn't carry money around. So Jack basically said, "Well, can't you turn into anything you want? Turn into a coin and pay for my drink." And the devil said, "Oh, sure." Well, Jack picked up the coin, that was actually the devil, and stuck it in his pocket next to a crucifix, which of course meant that the devil couldn't change shape back into the devil. Well, Jack carried him around in his pocket for a while and finally made a bargain with the devil that said that if Jack let him out, that the devil wouldn't bother him for another year. Well, the year ended and the devil rolls back around and Jack says, "All right, well, at least let me have a snack real quick. Climb up in that tree and get me an apple." So the devil climbs up in the tree, but while he's up there, Jack carves a cross into the trunk of the tree, which of course leaves the devil stuck in the tree. So after more begging and pleading, they make another deal, and Jack says, "You got to leave me alone forever. You can never come for my soul." And the devil agrees, and Jack lets him out of the tree. Well, you might remember that Jack had already run into an angel and was not allowed in heaven, and now the devil was not going to take him to hell. So when Jack actually died, he was kind of stuck. He couldn't go anywhere. So he showed up in hell thinking that the devil would let him in, but the devil said, "No, that wasn't our deal." But according to legend, the devil gave him one ember, one coal that he could take with him to carry around for the rest of his dying days, not living days. And so Jack wanders around Ireland with that one coal inside of a hollowed out turnip to hold the coal. So, don't know how much truth is in that story, but one of the cool things about Samhain that I thought was just so neat is that it was a fire festival. And so everybody in the village on Samhain night would let the fires in their hearth burn completely out. And then everybody would go to that one bonfire and take a piece of that fire with them to restart the fire in their house. And it was just one way that the whole village was connected until the next festival. And one of the thoughts is that perhaps when they were taking the fire back to their houses, they would put embers into hollowed out turnips, because turnips is what they had at the time. Now, when the Irish migrated to America, they found these really awesome things that were a lot bigger than turnips and a lot easier to carve and had a lot more space on the inside, and they were called pumpkins because pumpkins are native to the Americas. And so when Irish immigrants came here, instead of carving turnips, they started carving pumpkins for Halloween. And so we think that that is where the jack-o'-lantern came from. All right, so hopefully you learned a little something about the history of Halloween and maybe got a start on your project. I didn't get very far because I was busy talking. But anyway, if you like this format, if you like listening to a little history while you make a project, make sure you like and subscribe to History in Stitches, and definitely check out our other videos because we've got some cute tutorials and things like that. So we'll see you next time.